for me and a great honor to welcome among us as a guest of the FJelinekSeries seminar, Professor Olivier Bonami comes from Paris, both from the university and from the what we would call Academy of Science. And he will deliver a talk on morphology. So in a way, it's a kind of follow-up of the last Monday session, which was also more or less linguistic. So we continue in the linguistic line, but with some I don't want to say deviations, but some side remarks in the direction of formal methods of formal linguistics. So welcome in Prague, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm delighted to talk to you today about empirical evidence for paradigmatic organization across morphology. So this is an empirically oriented talk about, so it's an empirically oriented talk using computational methods to answer theoretical questions, basically. I'm a theoretical linguist. I'm an empirically minded theoretical linguist. And I've tried to select things that might be of interest to this audience in one way or another. Oh, now it has stopped working. Did I do something foolish? Oh, here, nothing is moving in at all. So no problem. Okay. Okay, now it moves. Okay, thank you. A common view of the structure of a word formation system is that, well, every lexeme has to either be simple or be derived from something else, okay? And so this leads to a very simple and beautiful picture of what lexeme formation is about. It's about rooted trees. So basically, this is what it's supposed to look like. So you have the family of the English noun center, and then you develop a tree from this. And any similarity among items that do not stand in this base derivative relationship has to follow from their having a common base. So the fact that, for instance, centralization and decentralization look alike and have similar meanings is not accounted for by having a direct relationship among them, but through the fact that they share some ancestor. Okay, and so this is a very common view of word formation. You're shared across many approaches. I haven't dared quote the Czech tradition. So I went to the easy thing and reminding that the tradition set about by Aronoff 76 goes in that direction. And it's also central to morphological resource development, in particular to the kind of efforts like Binet and universal derivations done here. So we know, and we've known for decades, that there are plenty of glitches, of small phenomena that get in the way of this way of thinking about derivation. And I'm just going to do a small compendium. So some of them are going to be very familiar, others might be not so familiar. So one very familiar one is backformation. So in backformation, what looks like an output arises first and motivates what looks like an input. So for example, in English, the verb bartend very clearly comes from the noun bartender rather than the other way around, despite the fact that bartender has a suffix that bartend doesn't have. Okay, so in conversion, since Marchand, since the 60s, we know that in many cases, when you have a conversion pair, it's not clear which one comes first of the two. And in recent work on French, Delphine Tribou has shown, doing this, studying conversion much more systematically than Marchand did, that at scale, most examples of conversion are cases where it's actually undecidable which of the two would come first. Okay, and so in that situation, well, we can take an arbitrary decision that one of the two is the base and the other the derivative, but that decision is not motivated by any kind of linguistic argumentation. Okay, cross formation is another familiar phenomenon of that kind. So the term is due to Becker. And the idea is that you have cases where morphological relation between two complex items, we have two complex items that are in relation despite the absence of a base. So that's the case for fascism and fascist. We don't have a base for them to relate to, or the existence of a much looser relationship to the base than there is between the two derivatives. So I will elaborate more on that example later, but if you think of socialism, socialist, is very clear what the relationship between socialism and socialist is. It's not so clear. Okay, you can reconstruct why it's based on social, but the relationship is a lot less direct. Okay, so moving on to things that are less well known, we have cases of multimotivation where there's actually two equally likely paths leading to a derivative. So asymmetrical in English is such a case. So it could easily come from symmetrical or from asymmetry. And in a way, it comes from both. And we would not like to have to decide on this. But of course, if we have to have a tree, we have to take a decision. Okay. More complicated and interesting, we have situations of form-content mismatches where so the formal base of a derived item seems to be different from its semantic base. So if you think of frequentist, the adjective frequentist, formally, obviously it comes from frequent, but in terms of its meaning, so a frequentist is somebody who cares about frequency, not somebody who cares about frequent things, right? So you have, you can't really decide which of these two should be the base, okay? And actually there's good reasons to think that one is and good reasons to think that the other one is. One extra complication that actually follows under form-content mismatches are cases of what I call family support. So this is based on Bonami Strnadová's work, familiar to some in this room. So if you think of the adjective senatorial, so formally, clearly, it comes from senator, but in terms of its meaning, it can mean either relative to senators, as in a senatorial family, or relative to the Senate. Okay, so it actually has both meanings. And so what should we say? Should we say that it comes from both? Well, then we need to split it as two nodes in our derivation tree, and that's kind of unintuitive, right? Okay, so what can we do about this? So how do theoretical morphologists react to this? So there's three main reactions in the literature. The most prevalent one is dismissal. Okay, the most prevalent one is saying, yeah, the lexicon is ugly. Strange things happen in the lexicon. And we can, these things happen every once in a while, and we can just ignore it and continue doing morphology as usual, right? So that's the dismissal approach. And then if you believe in that, then rooted trees are fine, okay? So among people who take this data seriously, who think it's important to model it, there's actually two different approaches to modeling it. So one is what I call the reformist approach, which is to say we want the rooted tree plus, right? So we keep the rooted tree model of derivation, but on top of the rooted tree, where it's warranted, where there's no avoiding it, we have a higher order notion of a paradigmatic relation between leaves in the tree, okay, or between nodes in the tree, okay? And that's a tradition that started with Van Marle's 84 book, and that then has become very popular in frameworks such as construction morphology or relational morphology. Another way of doing things, which is what I call the revolutionary approach, is to say, well, the very existence of these phenomena question the relevance of the rooted tree approach, and we should ground morphology into something else than rooted trees, right? And so that's where the idea of a derivational paradigm comes in. Well, instead of, or in addition to having a rooted tree of your relations between, capturing some aspects of relations between words, we want to have a fully paradigmatic view of the relations between lexemes. And so this is not a new idea. It's as old as modern word and paradigm approaches, but it has become a lot more popular in recent years, and there's been a lot of excitement in theoretical morphology about that. I'm not going to talk about these theoretical questions today. That's not my focus. My focus is really on what is the empirical evidence. Is there significant empirical evidence to think that something should be done that we shouldn't be happy with just rooted trees. Okay, so I want to note at the outset that, well, the appeal of each of these options really depends on how central and systematic the relevant relations are. Okay, if indeed, you know, it's every once in a while an accident that these things happen, we don't really need, then clearly the conservative approach is what should be preferred. If we can document systematic empirical paradigmatic relations, then we should worry seriously about what to do with them. Okay, and I'm going to argue that we should, but taking different points of view. Okay, so that's what I want to do. I want to provide empirical arguments for the role of paradigmatic relations. The first thing that I need to do that is to clarify what I mean by paradigm structure. So to have a way of making sense of the very idea of paradigm structure in the context of derivation. And so that's relatively old work, but that I need to start with to get us on firm ground. And then we'll present to you 3 case studies arguing on different aspects of this. So the first one is going to be about form predictability, showing that derivational families exhibit omnidirectional form predictability, just like inflectional paradigms do, that you can predict from one corner of the family to another. The second sub-study will be a behavioral study. So that's the part that is clearly outside of formal and computational linguistics. So this will be experimental evidence that speakers actually are sensitive to that structure. And then we will turn to semantic predictability, and that will be the main topic for today. I will try to show that in some parts of the system, derived items are strongly predictive of each other, while their formal base is not. Okay, so that's the plan. Okay, before I get to the plan, 2 clarifications. What will I not address? I'm not going to talk about the difference between inflection and derivation or the lack of such a difference. It's a very interesting topic, which I happen to be very interested in, and other people around here have been, but it's not the topic for today, and arguably it's a question that's orthogonal to the issue of whether paradigms are relevant in derivation. So paradigms might be relevant whether or not inflection and derivation are clearly different from one another. Okay? And likewise, I will not talk at all about whether segmentation into morphs or morphemes plays a central role in derivational morphology. Again, that's a hotly debated issue in contemporary morphology, one that I'm interested in and working on, but again, so, well, whether you believe that morphemes play a central role or not, paradigms might still play a role. Okay, so that's not what I will be focusing on. Okay, so let me first start by trying to clarify what I mean by a paradigm or a system of paradigmatic relations in the context of word formation. And the idea here is that we'd like to take inspiration from the work that has been done on inflection in this area over the last few decades. So this has been an extremely fruitful, there's been an extremely fruitful research program exploring horizontal relations between words in inflectional paradigms. So not worrying about how do the inflected forms derive from a simpler thing, a root or a stem, something like that, but exploring the relations between surface words, okay? And that has been very fruitful and has taught us a lot about inflection. And the idea is, well, we would like to be able to apply the same kind of methods to derivation. And so we need to devise a notion of paradigm that makes sense both of what we know about inflection and of derivational families. Okay, and so to do that, there are 2 crucial insights that we should pay attention to. One is that paradigm is about content, not about form. Okay, let me clarify what I mean by that. The way the paradigms are structured, when we talk about paradigm structures, we're talking about contrast in content. Okay, and this is obvious if you look at, well, some English paradigms. So this is, I'm looking at part of the paradigm of a few English verbs, and it should be obvious if you look at them that, well, what allows us to say, well, this is one cell in the paradigm and this is one cell in the paradigm is clearly not the relationships of forms between these words. Rather, what we do is that we set up the paradigms by looking at the contrast in content, and then we worry about, well, what does this tell us about form? This is the way we think about when we talk about inflectional paradigms, okay? And the idea that really comes from Steckhauer is that, well, if we are to make use of the notion of a paradigm in derivation and make parallels with inflection, then the same should hold. Okay, so that's a crucial point. The second crucial point is about morphosyntactic features. So when we think about inflectional paradigms, when people think about inflectional paradigms, very often they think of them in terms of a system of feature oppositions that are normally orthogonal to one another. Okay, and so this is captured by this, well, Wunderlich and Fabry happen to put that in a simple sentence. They're definitely not the first or the only people believing in that. So they say, yeah, a paradigm is an n-dimensional space whose dimensions are the attributes or features used for the classification of word forms. Okay, and so what I want to point out here is that this actually does not work very well for the description of inflection. It works in ideal cases. It doesn't work very well in general. Okay, so if you think, so an ideal case, what I would call orderly paradigms, are Italian adjectives. Okay. Why? Well, very clearly you have gender agreement and plural agreement. These are independent of one another. For every gender, there's a number. For every number, there's a gender. And all the forms are distinct, so we have no hesitation as to which word fills which cell in the paradigm. Okay. But if you look at other, well, if you look at basically anything except Italian adjectives, things become messy. So I'm using English conjugation because it's a kind of striking example of things getting messy that is also familiar to everybody. But we could actually look at the conjugation of in any Indo-European language and arrive at kind of the same conclusions. Yeah.
Pronouns should be masculine and feminine.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, this should be masculine and feminine. Yeah, sorry about that. Hopefully the English paradigm works better. So when we think about English conjugation, so this is my best attempt at trying to put this in nice rows and columns, but you see that it's leaky from all directions. Okay, so there are empty cells, so there are combinations of features that don't make sense. Okay, and there's a lot of syncretism happening to the extent that, yeah, who would want to say that there's actually 6 different past forms in English? Well, no verb except be has more than one. Okay, so probably we want to say that there's full neutralization and maybe we just need one paradigm cell. But then the past starts looking a lot different from the present, where you have other distinctions happening. Okay, so and on the face of it, when you look at English, it's very tempting to say, well, there are 5 different forms in an English paradigm. And sure, the mapping between these forms and what they mean is a lot more complex than what we have for Italian adjectives, but that's exactly what the English system is, right? So that's what it means to make sense of the difference between the Italian and the English system. Okay, so yeah, so paradigms are about content first, okay? And paradigm structure is not necessarily about nice orthogonal feature combinations, okay? With that in mind, here's a way of defining paradigms that, well, it's an outline of a way of defining paradigms that does away with the problems and works for both inflection and derivation. Okay, so here the idea is that our starting point is partial morphological families. So a partial morphological family is any set of morphologically related words. In this figure, they're represented as horizontal planes. Okay, and crucially, everything is going to be partial. Completeness is not our interest. Maybe sometimes it's complete, maybe it isn't. It's not our concern. And then a partial paradigmatic system is a collection of morphological families exhibiting the same set of contrasts in content. Okay, and that's what's captured by these horizontal black lines. They capture the fact that, well, the relationship between, let's say, wink and winks is parallel. The relation in content is parallel to the relation between stink and stinks, but also the relation between wink and winking is parallel to the relation between stink and stinking, etc., etc. Okay. And then the paradigm, well, is one member of a paradigmatic system. So it's a family that happens to participate in such a system of alignments. Okay. And a paradigm cell is just a set of words that enter in the same set of contrasts. So they're represented here vertically by vertical alignment. Okay. So the exact definitions are a little bit trickier than that, but that's basically the gist of it. And you will notice that nothing in what I have said depends on the words being related by inflection. I can do everything exactly the same with words related by derivation. So I can look at terms, nouns for disciplines and specialists of these disciplines in English, and the corresponding relational adjectives, which are systematically doing double duty, corresponding to both. And I can set up relations in exactly the same way between these collections of words based on their contrast in content. Okay. Crucially, if you do things in that way, paradigmatic structure is agnostic to the sharing of affixes. So being in the same paradigm cell is not about using the same affixes. Okay. So yeah, for specialists, sometimes it's in ian, sometimes it's in ist. Okay. For disciplines, sometimes it's in x, sometimes it's in ik, sometimes it's in logi. Okay. For adjectives, sometimes it's in all, sometimes it's in ik. Okay. That's not how you set up the paradigm. So just as here, you don't set up the paradigm by asking which affixes are present, the way you set up a derivational paradigm is not by looking at form, rather you set up the paradigm and then wonder about what are the relations of form. Okay. Also, at a more abstract level, paradigm structure is agnostic to direction of derivation. So it happens to be that in the case of logic, logician, logical, clearly logic is the base. Okay, but in terms of linguistics, clearly linguist is the base, and that's very different from the point of view of a rooted tree approach. But that's a different dimension of the organization of the system. That is not what the paradigm structure captures. Okay. So we're really talking about something else than what we talk about when we have a rooted tree. Okay, so now, with that in mind, okay, so we have an idea of what we mean by being in a paradigmatic relation for lexemes, okay? And now let's go to the empirical evidence. Okay, so the first kind of empirical evidence we're going to look at is implicative structure, as it's called by people working on inflection. So here's the idea. The idea is that the content of paradigms is partially predictable. The word form filling one cell is predictive of what word form could fill another cell. Sometimes it's perfectly predictive, sometimes it's partially predictive. So if you think again of English verbs, if you know, sorry, there's a problem with labels here. If you know what I call the plain form of verbs, so think of the infinitive or the present non-third singular, okay, and you want to predict the present participle, okay, so you have this prediction task. Well, it's very easy to answer because all verbs do it in the same way, okay, so the plain form is highly predictive. It's perfectly predictive of the present participle form. Actually, the present participle form is also perfectly predictive of the plain form. Okay, so you can do it in both directions with perfect accuracy. If we now look at plain and past participle, well, if we compare sing and sting, we see that things can't be that simple, but still there's a limited number of options. Right, so you could not anything in the world could be the past form of the verb word. Okay, so you have partial predictability, and so Wurzel in the 80s coined the term implicative structure to describe this aspect of the structure of paradigms. Those of you who are curious can check out the exact quotation from Wurzel, well, from the English translation of Wurzel, basically, this idea of implicative structure has been a central area of research of people working on inflection in the last 20 years, okay? So with different approaches coming on, so Adam Albright was arguably the first person to take this question seriously and to take seriously the idea of having computational tools to assess implicative structure. Then there's important work done by Rafi Finkel and Greg Stump. And then there's a whole line of work that was started by Farrell Ackerman, Jim Blevins, and Rob Maloof. And then a variety of people, including myself, have taken on this approach, which is basically a probabilistic approach to this question. Okay, so in the context of, well, let's see with a simple example from inflection what this amounts to. So in the context of inflection, look at what happens. So I'm using for ease of reference some data that is easy to me, easy to compute numbers on because I have it lying around. So I'm looking at the masculine singular and masculine plural form of French adjectives and trying to predict the plural from the singular. And when you try to do that, you will soon find out, if you explore a lexicon, that three possible things could happen. There are three relevant things to know, okay? Sometimes the singular is in al and the plural is in o, and sometimes there's no difference between the singular and the plural. But importantly, sometimes there's no difference between the singular and the plural, and still the singular is in al. So if the singular is in al, then you have an ambiguity as to what could happen in the plural. If the singular doesn't end in al, there's no possible ambiguity. It's always the same. Okay. So what we want to do is to make sense of this predictability structure. And the solution is relatively simple. First, you need to identify the relevant alternations between pairs of forms, okay, which is what I have just described. This is actually the hard part, because if you want to do that in a typologically unbiased way, be able to discover these things without preconceptions on any language, that's actually the hard part. That was the topic of my student Sasha Benjamin's dissertation. Okay, so that's very hard. But the rest is kind of trivial. Okay, you can say then, well, I want to assess the conditional probability of the shape in one cell given the shape in another cell. So, for instance, I want to know what is the probability that the plural is in O if the singular is in al. This is the same thing as finding out what is the alternation between the two if the singular is in al, right? Because if I know the alternation, I know the outcome. If I know the input and the alternation, I know the output, okay? And then you can estimate that probability just using these simple frequency data from some lexicon, okay? So it turns out that, yeah, the likelihood that it's O is 0.92, okay? And yeah, then you can explore that. And then, yeah, most people working in that area also then on top of this use conditional entropy as a useful summary of what happens between two paradigm cells for purposes of comparisons across the paradigm, okay? So using this method, what do we learn about French adjectives? So first we learn that there's high variability in the predictability of one form from another for a given pair of cells. So I've taken the very simplest example that I know of where there's variability. So that's why I picked that example. If I had picked something else, yeah, it wouldn't have fit on the slide. Okay, but so you see that, yeah, sometimes the conditional probability is 1, sometimes it's close to 1, sometimes it's low. Okay, yeah, so there's variability across lexemes. Okay, but then there's also variability across pairs of cells that you're looking at. Okay, so now if we look at all predictability relations between pairs of cells in French adjectives, so the numbers that I'm showing are the conditional entropies. So the higher the number, the less predictability, and the thickness of the lines are supposed to show you how predictable it is. So we see that sometimes it's 0, it's fully interpredictable. Sometimes it's relatively hard. So here we go up to 0.666, okay? But you have important differentials, and in particular important differentials in terms of directionality. So if we look again at our singular and plural, so predictability is high, the numbers are low, but there's a big difference between the two. So there's a difference of 1/2 between predicting to the plural or predicting from the plural. Okay, and that variability is interesting. It teaches us all kinds of things on the structure of inflection systems. And I could give you a different talk explaining, yeah, what this teaches us about the typology of inflection systems, etc. That would be the topic for another talk. What I want to do instead is, yeah, point out that, well, one can very easily do exactly the same thing for looking at derivationally related words rather than inflectionally related words. Okay, and that's what we did in the second part of that paper that I talked about earlier, that 2019 paper. So we took from a derivational database triples of a verb, an action noun, and an agent noun that we happen to have. Well, it's important for us to have phonological transcriptions because French orthography is such a mess that looking at French from an orthographic point of view is completely confusing, right? So if we were working on a more well-behaved language, we wouldn't really need to do that. So if I do this with orthography, it actually takes a full page to describe the patterns because the orthography is a mess. So we did exactly the same thing. And we can show, doing the same thing, that we find exactly the same kind of thing, right? That we have differential predictability depending on what the base is in the case of one particular pair of lexemes, okay? And also some cells are easier to predict from others than others. And when you look at what is easy, it's actually counterintuitive from the point of view of a rooted tree approach, because as you can see, it's easier to predict the verb from its derivatives than to predict the derivatives from the verb. Surprising if you think that knowing the base is what's important, okay? Information actually flows better in the other direction. And in addition, if you look at, so action nouns are kind of equally predictable from the verb or the agent noun, but agent nouns are much easier to predict from the action noun than they are to predict from the verb, okay? And so that suggests that these horizontal relations, these paradigmatic relations that do not coincide with a base derivative relationship are actually something important that tells us something about the structure of the system. Okay, so if somebody is really curious about French, I can explain why this is so. So one of the virtues of this approach is that it's not a black box. You can go and trace exactly what were the computations and find out what are the generalizations about the shape of the system that lead to these particular conditional probabilities. But I won't do that because I don't want to give a course in French morphology. What I will do instead is move on to the second study, which is a direct follow-up of the first study, which is work that very recently done with my student Maria Kopot. So in the previous section, what I have shown is that the existence of there's non-trivial implicative structure in both inflection and derivation. Okay, so we've seen predictability across pairs of cells, predictability variation across pairs of cells, and also we've also found that for a given pair of cells, some items are more predictable than others. Okay, and so this is all well, but that doesn't tell us whether this is important, right? So the fact that this predictability structure exists doesn't tell us that it's important. In particular, it's not obvious that speakers of a language are aware of that structure and can use it for some purpose. Okay, so in these two studies, what we want to do is to show that, well, we're not showing that the speakers are using it, but actually we're just showing that they're aware of it. Okay. Okay, so how did we do this? So this is an experiment. In this experiment, participants are shown a video of an utterance containing two forms of a pseudolexeme. We're showing them a video of somebody speaking because French orthography, right? Again, French orthography is such a mess that we want to have them exposed to the spoken form. Okay. So the participant hears something. So this is one of the interns that helped us, well, that were in the videos. You have a sentence like this one. So we, and then some form of a verb in the present first plural. We blah blah the pop culture quiz almost every year. It's Pierre who has, and then the corresponding past participle. Okay, and then we ask participants to judge how good the second form sounds. Okay, and so they have a scale that they can use. And what's important for us is that we manipulate the relationship between the two word forms that they will see. Okay. So on the one hand, we manipulate it in terms of what paradigm cell is the first one and what paradigm cell is the second one. Importantly, we have cases where the predictor is the infinitive, the citation form, and according to everybody, including myself in previous work, is what should be the root of the tree if you have a tree-based view of French inflection. So sometimes the infinitive is the predictor, sometimes the infinitive is the target rather than the predictor, and sometimes neither the predictor nor the target are the infinitive. Okay, so we're interested to see what happens across the board. Okay, so we are manipulating this, and then we're also manipulating how likely that particular second form is given the first form. So using the same kind of techniques I've presented in the first study, we're assessing the predictability of different possibilities, and we are going to measure whether participants are sensitive to these differences. Okay, so in that case, so if the present is nous édrilons, the most likely form for the participle is édrilé. Okay, and it's a lot less likely that it's édrilé, but it's possible, and a still slightly lower possibility is édrilu. Okay, what happens? Well, what happens is what we expected. So this is this plots the conditional effects of a model, of a statistical model that I won't give you the, well, I have a slide with the details in case somebody wants the details. But so this is basically what our model of the experimental data tells us about the relationship between paradigmatic predictability and the acceptability judgments proposed by participants. And you see that whichever pair of cells we're looking at, the predictability scores predicts, so an increase in the predictability score predicts an increase in the acceptability judgment. So the lower the score, the worse that's acceptability judgments, okay? And in addition to this, if you look at the slopes of these various curves, so clearly where the prediction is strongest is in the blue curve, and that's when we're predicting towards the infinitive, which is exactly the opposite of what we would have expected, right? So predicting the citation form, the most common form, is actually where these predictability relations matter most, okay? So clearly, speakers are aware of the statistical tendencies that we have found to be present in the lexicon, okay? Now, okay, so that's the model details. Now, important for our purposes today, we can do again exactly the same thing for derivation. And this time, so for the inflection study, the data was not exactly the same as for the lexical study. But so here we're looking at exactly the same thing. So verbs, action nouns, and agent nouns, just as we did when looking at predictability in the lexicon. So now people see things like this, followed by an agent noun is a professional of, and then an action noun of the same derivational family. And again, we're asking people to judge the second, how good that second word sounds. We're again manipulating the pair of cells under examination, looking at all 6 possibilities among verb, action noun, and agent noun, so that we have something that matches what we did previously over the lexicon. And again, we're looking at situations where the predictability value of the second word is variable. And, well, big surprise, we get exactly the same effect. Okay, so we get exactly the same effect across the board. The predictability score of the output word, okay, as established by looking at what's in the lexicon, matches the acceptability judgments that speakers will produce. Okay. And notice in particular, importantly, that prediction from the base, so in those cases, the base is always the verb. So predicting from the base in terms of a tree-based approach is not privileged in a way compared to the other ones. We have the same result across the board, whether the verb is involved, whether we're predicting from the verb to the verb or disregarding the verb entirely. We get the same results. Okay. Okay. So again, yeah, modeling details are not really important. Okay. So what I have shown so far is that, well, the results that we had just by looking at the statistical structure of the lexicon are actually matched by speaker behavior, at least in terms of awareness of these predictability relations. Okay, so to be fair, we haven't shown that this actually matters in practice in speech production or comprehension.